We have so many stories in our lives, but our stories are not always heard. On the Hear My True Story podcast, we tell our own true stories.
Before the white car backed, our head teacher had scattered. Looking at him, I could only see his tie that was flying backwards, waving at us, and he disappeared in thin air.
I want to share my life story. I want to share my voice with the people because I know that just a small joke I can tell through this podcast, it will make someone smile.
When you ask me what I fear most in life, I would definitely respond to you and say it's fear itself.
We are fighting for togetherness. We are fighting for equal rights. We are fighting to end injustice.
You don't have to be a storyteller or writer because, guess what? Life writes the best stories.
Hear my true story.
This is your favorite time of the week with your number one podcast.
Hear my true story.
Thank you so much for joining me again on this wonderful podcast. It is me, your host, Otako, and I'm really happy to have you again this wonderful week. Yes, before we start this wonderful podcast, I want to say thank you for always listening to the wonderful podcast every week and coming and listening and giving me comments and sharing about the podcast. That's so grateful. And for those who are just joining us right now on this episode, who have not listened to the episodes before, this is Hear My True Story podcast, where we tell people stories, share personal stories, conversations based on real life experiences. Yeah, and we are happy that we have you on this wonderful podcast. Anyway, today I'll share with you a wonderful, it's not a personal story, but it's a wonderful conversation that I had with a friend of mine who we are talking about so many things that happen in life and names that come up in life and people take them on. Yeah. So one time I was talking with my friend of mine, from Europe, a white friend of mine, and then when we are talking and then I raised the thing, okay, he was putting on a t-shirt which was like, I am a Mzungu. I'm like, okay, you're my friend. Why are you putting on a t-shirt that is having I am a Mzungu? Do you know where that comes from? I mean, it is something that people wear, but they don't know. Yeah, I mean, if you're a white person listening to this podcast, I'm going to break down for you the term Mzungu, what really it means. Anyway, so with my colleague, my friend, who was putting on this wonderful t-shirt, it was a really nice t-shirt saying, I am a Mzungu. I said, okay, would you like to be called Mzungu or would you like to be called your name? And then he was like, yeah, I can be called my name. I can also be called Mzungu. I said, okay, no problem. But anyway, for people who don't know what Mzungu means, today, listen to this podcast. I'm going to tell you, if you are not Ugandan, maybe you're not African, or maybe you're living in the US, when you travel to East Africa, you'll not be surprised to find that you lose your personal name and you'll get a name from the community, and that name will be simple. It will be called Mzungu. And where does this word Mzungu come from? Anyway, the word is often used in East Africa to refer to white people or to a white person. That word originates way back from the East African coast during the times of colonialism, when the white explorers, the light-skinned explorers came to East Africa from Europe. So as they came to East Africa on the East African coast, so there were tribes that speak Swahili who were speaking Swahili using the word which is called Zunguka. I mean, Zunguka is a Swahili word that refers to, just walking around with aimlessly, wandering around. That's Zunguka. So these European explorers were like coming to Africa, going on the East African coast. When they ask them, what are you doing? What are you looking for? And they're like, no, we are just traders wandering around aimlessly. So that's where the word comes from, Mzungu. It comes from Zunguka, which means like wandering man. So the European explorers who were wandering around the East African coast ended up to get that wonderful word, Mzungu, which comes from Swahili language.
With you every week. Hear my true story.
The European explorers were looking for their own way because the white European explorers were just wandering by their own and they didn't know the way. So the Swahili-speaking people at the coast said, "Wantu wanazunguka zunguka wanakwenda wapi?" Meaning these were people wondering where are they going. So the word spread all over East Africa. And when Europeans came in large numbers, the word Mzungu became the new word in East Africa. And that word is to date being used. So if you're a white person and you go to East Africa, don't be shocked when someone says, "Hey, Mzungu," please reply yes or no. Are you the one? "Hey, Mzungu," they'll say yeah. Because it is not a bad word if someone is talking to you in a nice way, unless when someone is really attacking you, maybe someone is aggressive to you, then you may feel bad about it. But it is a word that you cannot relate to any racial discrimination. No. Mzungu is just a word. It does not discriminate you. Yeah, this I can say, because in Uganda, locals call Europeans by the name Mzungu, wherever you come from, whether you come from Britain or England, or you come from Germany, or you come from, wherever you come from, whether you come from Britain, or whether you come from Denmark, or you are coming from Netherlands, or you are coming from Germany, they'll call you by the word Mzungu because they would describe you because it means white person. So don't be shocked when you are a European with a Chinese and then they call you Mzungu and they will call a Chinese because they differentiate it clearly. People coming from Asia will be called by their national country names. If someone is coming from India, will be called Indian. They will not call the Indian Mzungu. No, they'll call Indian. If a Chinese is in East Africa, they call him Chinese. If Japanese is in East Africa, they'll call them Japanese. They will not call them Mzungu because they describe the people from Asian countries by their Asian national names of their countries. Yeah, so you will not find a Ugandan, even though children calling a Chinese Mzungu. They'll say Chinese, but they'll call a European, regardless whether they're coming from Central Europe or East Europe, they'll call you Mzungu because that's the term they really. And you don't also be surprised when you find that some people will literally use the word Mzungu to other fellow black African people. If you are you're a rich person in Uganda, someone will say, "He's spending a lot of money. Is he Mzungu?" Although you are not a white-skinned person, or maybe you are not even a light-skinned person, they'll say, "That man is a Mzungu. He spends a lot of money because of money." Because the word moved from just referring to people with white skin color or light-skinned people to people who spend money. Because Europeans, when they come to East Africa, they spend a lot of money. There's that stereotype that they have the money, although they are also poor. But there's a stereotype that all Europeans have money. So when they see you, Mzungu, they expect you have money. So even though when you're a black African or a black Ugandan, going back to Uganda, you're coming from Europe, or even when you live in Uganda and you're spending a lot of money, people say, "That man is a Mzungu. That woman, she's a Mzungu. She spends a lot of money," describing you that you are a rich person. You have money. They'll say you're Mzungu, you have a lot, you are spending money. That you'll find this being used a lot in parts of East Africa, Rwanda, Burundi, where they'll say, "Hey, Chizungu, Mzungu, yeah. Rich person, spending a lot of money." Yeah. Because Europeans were considered wealthy people. Although they are very poor Europeans that come to Africa to survive. I'm not saying is not true. It is true. I'm living in Europe. I know there are poor Europeans who come to Africa and they survive. And there are rich Africans who are in Africa spending money just like Mzungu. So they call them Mzungu because of their spending of money. Anyway, that has been a simple conversation. I mean, it's not too much about it. It just came from a little conversation that I had with a friend of mine. And then I said, wow, why not share with my colleagues on the podcast to get to know what the term Mzungu means? And if you really think I've not said the right information, yes, you are free to comment. You are free to get to me and say, Otako, that was not the right information. I have better information about it. Yeah.
Hit subscribe and don't miss the next episode. Hear my true story.
I want to give you some updates what's happening with the podcast. So we are really excited because you have supported us the past years, and this time we are looking forward for more support from our dear listeners. So if you have been listening to this podcast and really like the content that we give you on this podcast, please subscribe to the podcast. Something new about the subscription is that when you subscribe, you support the podcast. So when you go there on my podcast, you go to hearmytruestory.com, you'll see an option where you can become a supporter of the podcast. When you support the podcast, then you will support with any amount of money that you can afford. For example, it could be $3, $5, $8, $10. And when you support with that, that makes a difference. That gives us the support to really produce the content, because the podcast is an independent podcast and we have been doing it as independent podcasters. Me, myself, with some other team in the background that some of the times you hear here on the podcast, some of the time you don't hear them. So we are really, really, really happy when you support the wonderful podcast, Hear My True Story, with a subscription. So the next update on our podcast is that in the month of February 2023, we shall be going on a wonderful break because we need some break. We have been producing content since January 2022 to December 2023, then January 2023. So we need a break. In this break, we use it to create more content, to come up with more ideas. And for that reason, we need this wonderful break to use it. However, when we are having a February break, when we are there 4 weeks not posting new content, we shall be republishing some of the best content that we have done on our wonderful podcast. We shall publish them again so that our dear listeners can enjoy, can really listen to the wonderful conversation, really listen to the wonderful stories, and then again give us wonderful comments and feedbacks. Yes, we are choosing stories that have made impact and stories that have made it till last year 2022. So that's update number 2. Then the last update I would want to say is that you are our dear wonderful listeners. So the beginning of the podcast, we had a wonderful collaboration between Omuti Creative, which is an organization from Uganda in Kampala, and we did our first season of Hear My True Story, Kampala, season 1. It had wonderful stories. It had wonderful conversations. So this year, 2023, we are again coming back with another season. Hear My True Story, Kampala, season 2. Watch out, our dear listeners. I want to say thank you so much for listening to this wonderful podcast. It has been me, Otako, your host, and I'm really happy to have you always listening to my wonderful podcast. And I hope to hear from you again next week, sometime, same day. Every Tuesday, you have an episode from our podcast. We are happy that you support, and we are happy that you have continued to listening to us.
We not only have voices for a podcast, but also faces for YouTube. Don't miss your next episode. Hear my true story.
Thank you for listening to our podcast, Music by Edwin Matovo, hosted and produced by Otako. Subscribe to our podcast for more stories and visit us on our website, hearmytruestory.com, for more stories. All the links are listed in the show notes of this podcast.